never believed in curses until I knelt on floorboards that wept blood beneath my knees. This is not a confession born of guilt, though guilt lives in me now like a second skeleton, pressing against the inside of my ribs with every breath I take. This is testimony. This is the only way I know to tell what happened in the summer of 1884, in a place where even God seemed to have turned his face away, leaving only darkness and the memory of screams. My name is Elijah Brennan, and I was 26 years old when I arrived in Calhoun County, Mississippi. The war had been over for nearly 2 decades, but the South still wore its scars like a widow wears black, visible in every sagging porch, every field gone to seed, every man who walked with a limp and a distant look in his eyes. I had been sent by the Methodist Episcopal Church to survey rural congregations, to assess which could be saved and which should be abandoned to the kudzu and the heat and the slow erasure of time. I was young, faithful, and arrogant enough to believe that faith alone could sanctify any ground, no matter how cursed. The church had no name that anyone would speak aloud. Locals called it the chapel, if they called it anything at all, but most just pointed when giving directions, their fingers aimed like accusations, their eyes sliding away from mine as if I had asked them to look directly at the sun. It sat 3 miles south of a crossroads town called Mercy, a name that tasted like ash in that country, at the end of a road so overgrown with blackberry brambles and wild honeysuckle that it barely deserved the title. The August sun beat down on red clay and cotton fields worked by men whose grandfathers had been property, and the air was thick enough to drown in, heavy with the smell of pine resin and turned earth and something else, something older and fouler that I could not name, but felt in the back of my throat like the taste of iron. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when the heat was at its worst. The church was small, built of weathered pine that had gone gray as old bone left too long in the sun. The steeple leaned slightly to the east, as if trying to pull away from the ground beneath it, and several of the roof shingles had curled up at the edges like dying leaves. There were no graves in the yard, which struck me as strange even then. Every country church I had ever seen kept its dead close, the headstones arranged in careful rows like crooked teeth. But here there was only grass, yellow and sparse, and a single oak tree that had lost most of its leaves despite the season. When I tied my horse to the post out front, he shied and pulled against the rope, his eyes rolling white, his nostrils flaring as if he smelled smoke. I should have listened to the horse. Animals know things we have forgotten. The door was unlocked. It opened with a sound like a man breathing his last, a long wheeze of rusted hinges and dry wood. Inside, the air was cooler, but not in a way that brought comfort. It was the cold of a root cellar, of a place dug deep into the earth where living warmth goes to die. The cold of a tomb. The pews were arranged in neat rows, 8 on each side, their wood dark and smooth from decades of use, decades of hands gripping the backs during prayers that may or may not have been answered. A simple wooden cross hung behind the pulpit, unadorned and severe, the kind of cross that spoke of old Protestantism, of a faith stripped down to its bare and unforgiving bones. Everything was clean. Everything was orderly. The floorboard showed no dust. The windows, though shuttered, let in thin blades of light that fell across the room like bars. And yet, the wrongness of the place settled on my shoulders like a cloak made of lead, a weight I could feel but could not explain. I spent that first hour exploring with the thoroughness my position demanded. There was a small vestry in the back, empty except for a cedar chest that held nothing but moth-eaten linens that smelled of camphor and decay. The pulpit was solid oak, its surface worn smooth where countless hands had gripped it while delivering sermons to congregations long since turned to dust. I found a Bible there, its leather cover cracked and peeling, its pages brittle and yellowed with age, opened to the book of Ezekiel. "Can these bones live?" I read, and felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise for no reason I could articulate. The words seemed to pulse on the page, seemed to carry a weight beyond their meaning, as if they had been left there deliberately, as if they were waiting for me. I decided to stay the night. It was my duty to assess the building's structural soundness, to determine whether the roof would hold through another winter, whether the foundation was still true. That was what I told myself. The truth, which I barely admitted, even in the privacy of my own thoughts, was that I wanted to prove I was not afraid. I had blankets in my saddlebag and a lantern with enough oil to last until morning. I would sleep in the sanctuary, wake with the sun, and write my report recommending the church be decommissioned and sold for lumber. Simple, clean, final. I was such a fool. As twilight came and the light through the shuttered windows turned from gold to amber to the deep purple of a bruise, I lit my lantern and sat in the front pew. I read scripture aloud, my voice small and fragile in that empty space, swallowed up by the darkness gathering in the corners like something alive and patient. I prayed, though I cannot now remember what I prayed for. Probably guidance, probably wisdom. Meaningless words that evaporated in the air and left no trace, no comfort, no protection. Full night fell like a curtain, sudden and complete, and that was when I first noticed the smell. It came slowly, creeping into my awareness the way cold creeps into a room when the fire dies, the way doubt creeps into faith when no answers come. It was the smell of iron, of copper pennies held too long in a sweating palm, of the slaughterhouse my father had taken me to as a boy to teach me where meat came from, to show me that death was part of the cycle, necessary and natural. But there was nothing natural about this smell. It was the smell of blood. I stood, holding my lantern high, my hand trembling just enough to make the shadows dance across the walls. At first, I found nothing. The walls were bare. The floor was clean. The cross hung silent and accusatory behind the pulpit. But the smell grew stronger with each breath I took, thick and cloying, coating the inside of my mouth and nose, and with it came a sound, a soft, rhythmic dripping, like rain falling on dry leaves, like water dripping from a pump, like something wet striking something dry again and again and again. I found the first stain near the base of the pulpit. It was small at first, no larger than my palm, dark and spreading slowly across the pine floorboards like a bruise forming on pale skin. I knelt without thinking, driven by some awful need to understand, to prove to myself that this was explainable, that there was a rational cause. I reached out and touched it. My fingers came away red, fresh, warm. The blood was warm. My heart began to hammer against my ribs like a fist pounding on a door that would not open. I told myself it was sap. Pine sap sometimes runs dark in the right conditions, sometimes pools in knots and cracks. But I had been around blood before. I had worked in hospitals after the cholera outbreak of '79. I had cleaned wounds and changed bandages and held the hands of dying men. I knew blood when I saw it. I knew the way it moved, the way it smelled, the way it felt against skin. This was blood. I stood and backed away, my boots scraping against the floorboards. That was when I saw the walls beginning to weep. It started high in the corners where the walls met the ceiling, thin rivulets running down the gray wood like tears from invisible eyes. Then more and more. The trickle became a flow, became a flood. The sound of dripping became a chorus, became a rain of blood falling from ceiling to floor, pooling in the cracks between boards, spreading in dark fingers toward my boots, like something reaching, searching, trying to touch me. I ran. God forgive me, I ran like a coward, like a child fleeing from nightmares made real. I crashed through the door and into the night, gasping for air that did not taste like a butcher's floor, air that did not carry the weight of iron and copper and death. My horse was gone. The rope hung limp and frayed from the post as if something had chewed through it. I was alone in the Mississippi darkness with nothing but cicadas and tree frogs, and that bleeding church behind me, its door still open, its interior glowing faintly with the light of my abandoned lantern. But I did not leave. I could not leave. Something held me there, rooted to that spot like the oak tree in the churchyard, something that was part duty and part disbelief and part terrible, growing need to understand what I had witnessed. I sat on the church steps as the moon rose, fat and yellow through the trees, and I waited for dawn to come and prove me mad or prove me sane or prove nothing at all. When the sun finally came, pale and hesitant through the morning mist that rose from the ground like the breath of ghosts, I forced myself back inside. The blood was gone, every trace of it, every stain. The floorboards were dry and clean and showed no sign of ever having been touched by anything more sinister than dust and time. The walls were bare gray pine. The ceiling was solid and whole. I walked the entire sanctuary, examining every inch with my hands and eyes, and found nothing to prove what I had seen. I began to doubt my own memory, to wonder if exhaustion and isolation had conjured visions from nothing, if my mind had played tricks in the darkness and the heat. I decided to stay another night. That afternoon, I walked the 3 miles back into Mercy, my shirt soaked through with sweat, my boots raising small clouds of red dust with every step. I asked about the church in the general store, in the barber shop, on the street corners where men stood in the shade and watched me with eyes that gave nothing away. The questions were met with silence at first, the kind of silence that has weight and texture, that presses against the ears like hands. Then came warnings dressed up as helpful advice. Roads bad that way. Best not go out there after dark. Snakes in that country, big ones. An old woman, her face lined deep as creek beds carved by centuries of rain, her hands twisted with arthritis, took my hand in both of hers and whispered close enough that I could smell tobacco and mint on her breath. That place don't want visitors. Never has. Never will. I asked her what she meant. She would not say, but she looked at me with eyes that had seen too much of this world and maybe the next, and she said, "Some ground is soaked so deep in sin that prayer just makes it bleed." I returned to the church before sunset, driven by something I could not name. I brought more lanterns this time, more oil. I brought my Bible and my faith and my stubborn northern certainty that there had to be a rational explanation for everything, that the world was governed by laws and sense and reason. I would watch. I would witness. I would document. I would understand. Night came again, and so did the blood. It started earlier this time, before the last light had fully drained from the sky. I watched it happen. I stood in the center of that sanctuary with my lanterns burning bright, and I watched the walls begin to seep. I watched the first drops fall from the ceiling. I watched the stains spread across the floor, and this time I did not run. I stood my ground and I prayed aloud. my voice shaking but growing stronger, reciting every psalm and hymn I could remember, every scrap of scripture I had committed to memory in seminary. The blood kept flowing. My prayers changed nothing. Then I heard the sounds. They came from beneath the floorboards, from somewhere deep below where I stood, shuffling like feet dragging across stone, scraping like fingernails on wood. A low moan that might have been wind moving through cracks, but was not wind, could never be wind. I heard chains rattling. I heard voices, faint and desperate, speaking words I could not quite make out, words in a language I did not know but felt in my bones. I heard weeping. I heard screaming, brief and sharp, and then cut off as if by a hand pressed over a mouth. I fell to my knees, and the blood soaked into my pants, warm and thick and real. I could feel it seeping through the fabric, touching my skin, staining me. I looked down and saw my reflection in the spreading pool, distorted and wrong. My face pale as a drowned man, my eyes too wide, my mouth open in a shape that might have been prayer or might have been horror. That was when I saw the gap in the floorboards near the altar, a space where two boards did not quite meet, widened slightly by age or settling or deliberate design. I crawled to it on hands and knees, my palms slipping in the blood, leaving red prints behind me like a trail, and I peered down into the darkness below. There was a space under the church, a cellar or a crawl space or something that had been dug with purpose and secrecy, and in the light of my lantern, held with trembling hands over that gap, I saw bones, dozens of them, hundreds. Human bones piled in the darkness like cordwood, like discarded refuse, like things that had never mattered to whoever put them there. Skulls with empty eye sockets, femurs and tibias and ribs, the remains of men and women, and God help me, children, jumbled together without care or ceremony or the basic decency of burial. Some still had rusted iron shackles attached to wrist bones and ankle bones. Some were small, too small. I understood then with a clarity that felt like drowning, like being pulled under dark water with lungs full of truth. The church had been built before the war, in the 1850s, when Mississippi was rich with cotton and the labor to pick it was bought and sold at auction like horses or furniture. I had heard stories, whispered in the right circles back north, about places where runaways were kept when they were caught, about rooms beneath churches and barns where the pursuit of human chattel was given the blessing of scripture and hymn, about the punishments meted out to those who dared seek freedom, punishments so severe that death came as mercy. This church had been one of those places. This sanctuary, built of gray pine and furnished with simple pews, had been erected over a chamber of horrors, a space where the enslaved were broken, tortured, killed, where their bodies were hidden in the dark when they finally stopped breathing, stacked like firewood and forgotten. Their blood had soaked into the earth beneath the floorboards. It had seeped into the wood and the foundation. And now, decades later, it rose again. The ground was bleeding. The walls were bleeding. The very bones of the building were bleeding in testimony to what had been done here. I vomited until there was nothing left in me but bile and sour spit and horror that tasted like metal. I tried to stand, but my legs would not hold me. I knelt there in the blood and the truth, surrounded by the evidence of atrocity, sanctified by prayer, and I wept. I wept for the dead beneath the floor whose names I would never know. I wept for the evil that men do in the name of order and property and God. I wept for my own ignorance, my own arrogance in thinking I could walk into this place with my education and my faith and my survey forms and somehow remain untouched by the weight of what had happened here. The blood flowed all night. I stopped trying to pray. What prayer could touch this? What words could wash away what had been done in this place? What scripture could speak to bones in chains? I simply bore witness. I sat in that pooling blood, and I watched, and I listened to the sounds from below, the rattling and scraping and weeping, and I let the horror of it fill me until I thought my heart would burst. At dawn, the blood vanished again, as completely as if it had never been. The floor was dry, the walls were clean, but I was still stained. My clothes were soaked through with it. My hands were red to the wrists. I could taste it in my mouth. I walked out of that church, and I kept walking. I left everything behind. My horse, my saddlebags, my carefully written survey reports. I walked north through fields and forests, through towns whose names I never learned, until I found a place where no one knew who I was or what I had seen. I never returned to Calhoun County. I never filed my report. The Methodist Episcopal Church sent letters asking about my findings. I burned them unopened. I left the ministry 6 months later, unable to reconcile what I had witnessed with any theology I had been taught, unable to stand in a pulpit and speak of a God who would allow such things to be done in His name. The church still stands, as far as I know. I heard through channels I no longer trust that it was officially abandoned in 1887, that the building was condemned by the county, that locals avoid it still, giving it wide berth, teaching their children not to venture down that overgrown road where the chapel stands alone. I am an old man now, past 70, with hands that shake when I hold a pen and a cough that will not leave my chest. My faith, such as it remains, is a quieter, darker thing than it once was. A candle that gutters in the wind but refuses to go out entirely. But I remember every detail of those 2 nights. I remember the smell of blood in the darkness. I remember the sounds from beneath the floor. I remember kneeling in a pool of supernatural testimony, surrounded by the evidence of crimes that no law had ever punished, no court had ever heard. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some ground is too stained by sin to ever be reclaimed or sanctified. And some churches, built on the bones and blood of the murdered and enslaved, will bleed forever, no matter how many prayers you pour on the floor, no matter how many years pass, no matter how much we want to forget. I prayed inside the church that never stopped bleeding, and I learned that some sins are too great for redemption. I learned that the dead remember even when the living choose to forget. I learned that blood, once spilled on ground stolen and perverted, will rise again and again, testifying to crimes that no scripture can erase and no time can heal. This is my testimony. This is the truth I carry. May God have mercy on us all, though I no longer believe we deserve it.